There you go. So this presentation will be recorded and sent to all the registrants, those present and the other people who have not yet made it on. And I think we'll be sending out a PDF of the slide deck as well. Is that all right, Kate, Rebecca? Yeah, so we'll be sending that out as well. If you have any questions along the way, you can enter them in the chat box. I will try to monitor that. Sometimes they escape me. My apologies in advance if that happens, but I'll ask Kate and or Rebecca if people can interrupt by unmuting themselves. That's completely up to the presenters, how you'd like to have that handled, but comments in the chat box, always welcome. So with that, I'll pass it over to, I'm going to pick Rebecca. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everyone. I guess I'll share my screen in a moment, but I'll introduce myself first. I'm Rebecca Campbell. I'm the Director of Therapy at Pasco. I've been here since September of 2019 as a psychotherapist and work with kids and adolescents and young adults and do parenting work. Prior to that, I had my own private practice and I've worked in Wilton High School and the Fairfield Public Schools as well. And I'm happy to be here to talk about our adolescents' emotional regulation with my colleague, Kate, if you'd like to take it away from here.
Yeah,
talk about yourself.
Definitely. So my name is Kate Austin. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm the Director of Occupational Therapy Training at Sasko River Center. I've been an OT for a little over 9 years now at this point. I've worked with clients of all ages, so infancy to adulthood and teenagers. I've worked in school settings, I've worked in outpatient clinics, I've worked in inpatient settings, so I have a kind of a wide depth of experience. And kind of like Rebecca mentioned and Mark mentioned as well, the presentation we're going to do today is kind of going to be looking at our teens and their kind of like overall presentation in a bunch of different ways. So I hope to kind of give you guys a little bit of information regarding sensory processing and how that can kind of be impacting your child's regulation. And then how that also can blend to Rebecca's side in terms of the emotional functioning and how that all plays together.
You're gonna have to give me a moment as I share the screen. Oh, there we go. Here we go. And I will kick it off as soon as, So, emotional regulation is a perfect example. My heart's starting to race a little bit. As I'm trying to figure this out, I'm getting a little bit of a pit in my stomach.
Going to be okay.
I'm going to be okay.
We're sending you virtual.
My prefrontal cortex is telling me that I know exactly where this presentation is on my screen. And I'm going to find it. I'm going to take some deep breaths. Hold 1 second, please, everybody. We just did this before. It's coming up. I promise.
I think we can all relate to Zoom-related technology issues. This is not something unique or individual to any of our experiences, I would say, through the pandemic.
Yes. Here it comes.
So some of you joining us, I know that Mark mentioned briefly in the beginning, the presentation is recorded. So you guys are welcome to ask questions at any time. If you'd like, you can use the raise hand function or you can put them in the chat. Mark mentioned he'll try to monitor that as best he can. Rebecca and I definitely encourage a really collaborative and kind of interactive presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free at any time to, reach out or touch base. If you would like to wait, there will be time for questions at the end. But a lot of the stuff that Rebecca and I will be talking about, we really love if you have individual questions or if you have anything that you feel is very important for you to be able to understand the information, you're more than welcome to kind of interrupt and ask questions. But there will be time at the end if you would like to hold them towards the end. That's okay.
Thank you, Kate, for saying that. And here we go. Okay.
There you go. Nice.
That was a lovely segue. So I'm going to be talking about emotional regulation, which I just had a little lesson and refresher in myself. As it's loading, I'll just start talking. Emotional regulation is basically how our ability to regulate our emotions. This is loading. You'll see it momentarily. I don't know that my laptop is regulating its emotions very well. Okay, here we go. It's our ability to regulate our emotions. And as adults, we've lived on this earth for decades, and we have probably figured out how to regulate our emotions, whether or not we are, if we're sad about something, and we recognize that we're sad and it's weighing on us, we might decide it's time to distract ourselves and get lost in a good book or put on a rom-com on Netflix to kind of help regulate that sadness and calm it down. If we're stressed out before a presentation, we're anxious, we may know that I know what's going to calm me down. I'm going to do 10 deep breaths in the bathroom, or I'm going to go talk to this colleague of mine and I'm going to work through my presentation, and I know that my anxiety is going to come down. So our ability to make these smart decisions about ourselves and how to regulate our emotions, similar to what I just went through, told myself my prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. And that is what helps to regulate our emotions. It's involved with, as the slide shows, focus, attention, planning, organizing, self-control. And it works in conjunction with the limbic system, which is one of the more primal parts of our brain, one of the first to develop in human development. And that is really it houses our emotions and memory. So when we're first born onto this earth, that's the part of the brain that develops first. We're hungry, we cry. We're not able to access language yet, and our brains develop. And finally, the prefrontal cortex develops. They say the brain isn't fully developed until about age 26, and they can talk to each other. So it's also important to note, and I won't talk about the brain too much, I just think it's really helpful sometimes to understand our brains first, and then how they regulate our emotions, and then talking about our adolescence. But there's a protective piece of our limbic system called the amygdala. It's like a little almond-shaped nugget in the back of our brains. It's our fight, flight, or freeze center, which you've probably heard about. And that is, it's a protected piece of our brain that was also evolved in the first stages of human development. You know, if you're a hunter-gatherer and a tiger approaches you, it's the part of your brain that allowed you to survive that. It kicked your body into a fight or flight mode. Probably you're going to flee the tiger. It literally dumps a chemical in your body that opens up your lungs so you're ready to run, get your heart racing, get your senses heightened. It can be a lot of cortisol, in which case you get that pit in your stomach. It just gets you ready to fight or flight. So basically, in an adult brain, ideally, you have an emotional situation and your prefrontal kicks in and tells you how to react to that. Like, for example, if you're driving and somebody in front of you brakes and makes a quick right turn, they didn't use their turn signal. Your first reaction, you might feel like, I take a deep breath. Your hands might tense up around the steering wheel. You may get a pit in your stomach, and you may be ready to like yell and scream obscenities, but then your prefrontal talks to your limbic and you're like, oh, your child's in the car. You need to model good behavior. So maybe you take a deep breath, and a lot of this is unconscious because, again, we've been on this earth living in our bodies and understanding how to be in the world. So we know what our coping skills are. So that's just a quick sketch of the adult brain. The adolescent brain is not yet developed. Their prefrontal cortex is not yet developed. And it can be confusing because they can act like adults to you. They can, as they become older, they can engage in more developed conversation. They, are driving, they have jobs, they're very self-sufficient. They're in the world in a much more responsible way. But we also have to remember, again, that their prefrontal isn't fully developed, and they are also living in such a different world than we grew up in. I mean, this 24/7 fast-paced world where at a moment's notice, anything can boomerang their self-confidence back and forth, whether it's on screen or in a classroom or at home. They are really operating in large part on their limbic system. It's really up to their prefrontal to calm that down. It's not as developed, and they've also not been on this earth as long as we have to understand themselves as well. So you layer that in with, there's a neurotransmitter called dopamine that some people have probably heard more and more of because we relate it to screens now. Like, kids get a dopamine rush when they're about ready to check and see how many likes they've gotten on Instagram. They may not even see the number yet, but they're already excited. Well, dopamines exist in our body long before the screens. It's an anticipatory neurotransmitter that gets kicked off, and it's like an anticipation of some kind of reward. So that's going to make a teen even more impulsive. For example, they might know that Samantha's having a party tonight. Well, you don't like your child to go to a party where you don't know if the parents are home or not. Your child doesn't know if the parents are home or not, but they're excited about the party. They really want to go. So they're going to tell you they're going to the movies instead. Because in that moment, between their impulse control being compromised by their underdeveloped brain, the dopamine kicking up, like, I'm going to get a reward when I go there. I'm going to see friends. It's going to be fun. They're not going to think about the consequences. In this moment, it is so exciting to go to that party. They're not going to be able to pull forward how much and how terrible it's going to be when they get caught by you and they lose the car for 5 days. So that's just a quick sketch of the developmental aspect of the brain and how it can compromise your adolescent. And then it's also just important to notice where your adolescent is in the stages of development. Right now, they're in this very important stage of separation and individuation, where really socially and emotionally, so much goes on with the interaction of their peers. And it's really important as their peers almost become their second family, as they separate from their family of origin, they try out new behaviors. They are actually supposed to push and test boundaries and probably make bad decisions. And it's up to you as the parent to help them through that. And it can be really hard to have your teen emotionally dysregulate. You become the bad person. You're embarrassing. I don't like you anymore. I can't talk to you. That actually means you've done a good job. I know it's really hard to stick with that, but that means that your teen is going through the necessary steps of separation and individuation. And so you layer that on to the brain, there's a lot of room for emotional dysregulation as your teen is navigating so much. So you can probably see then the importance of emotional regulation. It's really important that, and every teen brain is not the same. Some teens prefrontal is more developed, it's caught up, some are underdeveloped. It all depends on how your executive functioning skills have developed. But finding ways to regulate helps our teens to make better decisions, focus, communicate more effectively, and have better relationships and life outcomes. So we'll talk later about how we can help our teens with that, but I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who's going to spend more time talking about the sensory regulation piece to our adolescents.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. That was amazing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of sensory regulation. And I think one of the important things to kind of think about as well, we're going through this presentation, is kind of emotional regulation and sensory regulation are almost kind of like two sides of the same coin, because they both have the same term in it, right? Regulation. And so what does regulation mean? And a little later on, we're going to talk about what does true regulation mean? What does really calm, organized, like that kind of really regulated state feel like? But I wanted to discuss a little bit about sensory regulation, because in order for us to be able to have those higher level skills that Rebecca was talking about, to have access to that prefrontal cortex, to have that impulse control, to be able to make some of those decisions, to be able to work through our daily routines, we have to be able to have sensory regulation. And so sensory regulation in and of itself, if as a global definition, is the ability to take in sensory information from our environment and then being able to process it and do something with it. And so the presentation we're doing today is not on sensory processing, but I'm going to give you guys just a very quick little kind of, quick and dirty about it. So sensory processing is taking in that information and doing something with it. So the visual I have right now identifies all of the different types of sensory systems that we have. So there's the 5 that we're familiar with: sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. And there's also 2 additional systems: the proprioceptive, which is our muscles and joints, our body awareness, where we are in space, and then vestibular, which is our movement sensation. So not just our orientation of where our body is, but also how we move throughout. And all of these all of these systems globally work together underneath our conscious awareness. So all of us right now, we're all engaging in some level of sensory processing to be able to understand what I'm saying, to be able to filter out whatever's going on in your home or wherever you are attending this presentation, and be able to focus and pay attention. And so for our teens who are developing and growing, their sensory systems are still developing. They're still being able to process and integrate a lot of these different types of sensory systems in order to have sensory regulation. And so when we're able to take in the sensory information, process it, and then use it in a functional way that helps to benefit us and helps us to be able to move throughout our day, that's when sensory regulation can be really helpful. Sensory processing challenges can be their own kind of ball of wax, but sensory integration and using sensory information from our environment is something that everybody does. And so like Rebecca mentioned, in terms of emotional regulation, being able to handle those stress responses from the limbic system, being able to have an appropriate response to those high levels of dopamine when we're really excited or we're really, looking forward to something. If there are any sensory pieces to your teen's kind of profile, the way that they engage in their environment and way that they respond to certain sensory information, whether they're a seeker who really loves a lot of input, they're very athletic and they need to get out, or if they're somebody that's a little bit more reserved and tends to need that quiet time to regroup, how they process and handle sensory information is going to be a piece of it and can also be a tool that you can use and help your teen to better understand how to help them in terms of regulating their bodies and making them feel more comfortable. And then also you as a family being able to learn different ways to help kind of cope and regroup from some of the things that can be challenging for them on a daily basis. So the next visual I have is a really good one because I like to use this to kind of identify how both emotional regulation and sensory regulation can really be something that's almost like an iceberg. So the iceberg picture I love to use is really great because it identifies that what we see at the top, so what our teens are showing us, whether it's a behavior that Rebecca mentioned, like that kind of discourse for something like, this isn't fair, you don't understand what I'm talking about, or they're stressed and they're, having a lot of difficulty being able to express or regroup or cope from, say, a difficulty at school or a conflict with a friend. What we're seeing at the top is just what we call the behavior. So we're only able to see what our teen is showing us. But underneath is a lot of those neurological things that Rebecca was talking about. So those limbic system responses, this is where all of our sensory stuff is housed because it's all underneath our cognitive and our kind of conscious thought. So our sensory systems are processing and handling all of the sensory information without us having to use a lot of additional effort. However, like the picture on the side, if you have difficulty being able to process sensory information, if you are more sensitive, or if you do need more input throughout your day to feel more regulated, and you're not aware of this, or this is something that's not consciously coming up to you in terms of, hey, I am sensitive to sound, or hey, I do have a really tough time being in crowds, or oh, when I do have too much stuff on my plate, it does make me really overwhelmed. It can be very upsetting and stressful, especially for really bright and intelligent teens, because they can feel uncomfortable and they might not be sure why this is happening. And so, as we'll talk about a little bit later, kind of like teasing out, are there some sensory strategies I can use to help my teen to feel more regulated or calm? Or does my teen have some sensory sensitivities or some sensory challenges that I could help support them in? And are these the below the water things that are not, coming up as some more obvious things? We can kind of almost be sort of a detective for our teens and for our families and see, are there things that we can do to kind of help and support them in that way? Sensory, you can go to the next one, Rebecca. So sensory regulation, just like Rebecca mentioned, for emotional regulation is a state of development. So it all begins when we are born. So when we are infants and we just kind of like come into this world, we're all using our sensory systems constantly. That's why we have to basically baby-proof our house, because our infants are constantly sticking things in their mouth and grabbing things and touching things. And so we are all sensory beings. We need information from our environment to be able to learn. And as we grow older and as we develop, we then begin to piece and parcel out what sensory information is important, and then what sensory information is necessary, but not something I need to pay attention to. So when I put my clothes on in the morning, my nervous system says, hey, you're wearing a sweater, you're wearing a shirt, you're wearing glasses. But if my nervous system was constantly putting that at the front of my mind, it would be very distracting and actually really not helpful, because I need to do so many other things in my day than pay attention to the shirt that I'm wearing. So my nervous system and my ability through my own cognitive development as I've gotten older has been able to push that to the background. So it's not something I'm constantly paying attention to. But if it is something that's stressful or overwhelming for me, it can make it harder for me to be able to access those higher level skills and do some more of those things that are important for me. And we continue to develop our sensory regulation skills as we get older. So like Rebecca mentioned, the adolescent brain is still learning, it's still developing. So even though they are older and they're no longer at the stage, like I mentioned, with infants, where they're kind of seeking in that kind of like, not age appropriate way, they're still learning and developing and gaining mastery over their sensory systems and how they cope and how they decompress and what things they like and what things they don't like. And so from a sensory perspective, their ability to regulate themselves and how do they organize their emotions and how do they help regroup and how do they calm themselves is still a developing process. And so if there are any kind of hiccups along the way, like I mentioned with the iceberg, that may not be immediately apparent, this can be challenging for our teens. So I like to take a quick break here to kind of mention that we all do sensory strategies in some capacity to be able to help regulate. So having to take a closer look or to have a conversation with your teen about what kind of sensory strategies could help them is not out of the ordinary in any way, shape, or form, because everybody, even adults, do things. Having a cup of coffee in the morning is a sensory strategy. Taking a movement break in the afternoon to help kind of regroup while you're working from home is a sensory strategy. So there are lots of different things that you can incorporate into your day or to help your team kind of be able to be successful. And then the last piece I kind of wanted to touch base on before we kind of switch over to our next level of, actually we have two more, but sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So the last piece I wanted to just briefly talk about that's a little bit more into that OT kind of sensory realm, but also has a big piece for kind of what Rebecca was talking about, is praxis and social emotional skills. So I just quickly wanted to define praxis if you guys haven't heard of it before. So praxis is the ability to do a novel activity. So it could be literally anything. It could be something as simple as learning how to be able to build a model airplane, to being able to play a new sport, to learning how to drive a car. And it has a lot of different pieces in it. It has the ability to come up with an idea of what I want to do. I have to come up with a plan of how am I going to do what I want to do. It then has the ability to kind of think of, okay, what do I need to be able to do what I want to do, execute what I want to do, and then get some feedback from how successful was I in doing that thing, and then how can I retry that activity. So praxis is something that our teens are going through on a daily basis when they're learning new things at school, when they're interacting with their friends socially, when they're playing a new sport, learning to drive a car. So if there are any sensory sensitivities that are making their daily routines or their ability to engage in their environments, the praxis skills are going to be more challenging for them. These things are going to be more difficult. So if if a teen, say, has difficulty in that multisensory environment and can get really overwhelmed very quickly, doing something that requires a lot of multitasking, like driving, for example, could be very stressful and could be really challenging for them. So they could have to put in a lot of additional effort to be able to be successful with that. Or if, again, those multisensory environments are really challenging for them, a day at school, even though they may enjoy school and they like seeing their friends and they could be academically successful, it can be very stressful and very challenging. And so when they come home, they could be really, kind of toast. They could be really burnt out from that day. And so the praxis piece also has a piece that connects to the social emotional skills. So being able to develop this, as Rebecca mentioned right now, social skills, parties, engaging with friends, making friends, navigating, the social world is a big piece of what's going on for our teens right now. So developing social emotional skills, the ability to regulate and kind of organize myself when that friend I thought that was a friend said something unkind to me on social media, or I thought I was going to do something with somebody and then they said that they were busy and now I'm really disappointed. That ability to be able to develop those social emotional skills and the ability to regulate my emotions in connection to what's going on with our environment can have a piece that's connected to sensory pieces as well. So how do I regroup from that disappointing, kind of like last minute cancellation? How do I handle some of those more challenging social situations where I might be a little overwhelmed or a little uncomfortable? So I think it's important to kind of think of how are we helping to address not only their emotional regulation skills and their social skills, but also are there any sensory pieces we can use to kind of help support our teens to feel more comfortable in their bodies and feel more comfortable in the world at large, and also at home. Is there anything that we can do to be able to help them feel more comfortable? Rebecca, I think this is your slide for coping.
So coping skills. So thanks, Kate. I think we both just gave a broad sketch around social, emotional regulation and the different ways our bodies manage it. It's developed, received. So coping skills, coping is conscious or unconscious strategies used to reduce unpleasant emotions. Coping strategies can be cognitions, thoughts, or behaviors, and can be individual or social. So they are, as I think we would all agree and know at this point, are really important to help us manage our stress, our emotional regulation, improve our mental health, and alleviate these sensory system challenges that Kate was referring to. So perhaps you decide, you find yourself taking a deep breath before making a tough phone call. That might be unconscious. You might not think, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now with emotions. I really don't want to call back my child's teacher and hear what they have to say. I'm feeling very anxious. I think I will take a deep breath. You just might naturally know at this point to take a deep breath and try to regulate your system. Or it could be something conscious. You're feeling really upset about something, you're at home, you're overthinking, you can't focus. And you might know that if I get out of my house and out of my head, one of my personal favorites, and I walk, or I just go and switch up my environment, I'm going to bring down my overregulated system, and that's going to help me. It's going to distract me. It might put things in perspective for me. But that's what that's what it's referring to with conscious or unconscious coping skills that kind of get us through our days and through life. And I think also it's important to note that coping skills, consciously or unconsciously, knowing that we are masters in a way to an extent. I mean, sometimes we have life events that really overwhelm us and it's really, really hard to re-regulate. But in the day-to-day, that sense of agency and knowing I know how to calm myself down, like I made it through this tough moment, that can also help regulate, and it can help our teens regulate too. I've had a lot of adolescents feeling more comfortable with themselves and increasing their own sense of agency and sense of value, knowing like, oh my gosh, that actually worked. I took those 10 deep breaths, or I'm using the Calm app, or I'm doing these sensory soothing strategies, or I'm able to like have a mint in class, and that distracts me and it helps me focus better and not get so overwhelmed that I can't understand what the teacher's saying. I'm using Sense now, Sense, SCENTS, aromatherapy to help calm my system, distract me in some way, bring about a new association that's going to help me cope with however I'm feeling dysregulated. So I think we would all agree that coping skills are really important. Teaching our teens, you know, your teen has to want to calm down and be in the world in a regulated way. And so whether you're teaching them, they're learning from friends, teachers, their own therapy is really important. Kate, you want to take it away? What is true?
Definitely. So I wanted to, so Beatrice, you've mentioned getting lists of coping skills. We can definitely provide that. I don't think we have anything specifically written on the presentation, but we can definitely at the end when Mark provides the list of that, we can also provide a list of, I think, coping strategies.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely.
So I wanted to take a quick time just to kind of go, not tangential, but just to kind of explain something that I found when I was doing some of my research for the presentation, which I thought was really interesting. So I thought I kind of wanted to share with you guys, because I feel like this is something that is coming up more and more in the world that we live in, not just for our teens, but also for us as adults, in terms of our ability to regulate our emotions and also to feel calm, but also in a world where we're all very, very busy. We're all very scheduled, whether we're having our own work and, you know, personal things for our teens, whether they have school, sports, and social things. So I wanted to talk about the difference between downtime versus restorative downtime. So I did a little bit of research, and this was an article. I just wanted to read this. So there is some science that suggests that what our brains do when they're not actively processing information is incredibly important, and that when we let our minds wander, it can be replenishing. And so the article that I looked at and the kind of research study that I talked about activating a part of our brain called the default mode network. And so this is a specific part of our brain, and it is multi-connected. So it's not like Rebecca mentioned in terms of like the amygdala or the limbic system where it's a specific part. It's more of an interconnected sort of kind of web of what parts of the brain. So it kind of activates a lot of different areas. And I did this through functional MRIs when they were having the participants engage in certain activities. What they found is that this default mode network is comes into play from parts of the regions of the brain when we aren't focused on actually processing information. So it's a very specific type of activity. So it's not when you're not doing something, it's when you're not actively focusing. So it sounds kind of funny and a little bit quirky, but they kind of use this area or kind of part of the brain called the DMN. And the DMN is activated when you're focusing your attention inward rather than focusing on the external world. And it's been linked to things like creativity, memories, how we define our sense of self. And so being able to activate that DMN and being able to have that restorative downtime, the one that really deeply, deeply replenishes, they kind of mentioned the difference between light sleep and deep sleep. This is something that's similar to that. So being able to activate that DMN part of our brain and being able to have that restorative downtime means we need to engage in activities that access the part of our brains and this DMN area in a specific way. And I think it's important because one of the things that they talked a lot about in the article is making sure to not confuse the difference between leisure activities and downtime. So watching TV, reading a book, going for a walk, scrolling social media, those can absolutely be ways for us to relax. And those can actually be parts of downtime. So downtime is defined as anything that's in between what we're doing, right? So it can be the 5 minutes between, meetings at work or the 15 minutes you get, between, dinner time and when you need to, throw that load of laundry in. But the restorative downtime is when you're not processing information and you're not having to reason and engage in something that requires your attention. And so a lot of the examples they gave are things where you, what was the quote that they said? He actually defines it as sitting and staring into space. He said it's one of the greatest examples of restorative downtime. And I think that's actually really challenging. And we'll talk a little bit later about it. But it's interesting that in order for our brains to really completely empty themselves and totally decompress, we need to activate a part of our brain where we're literally doing almost nothing. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And I'm not saying that this is something that is easy to do, nor is it saying it's something that I personally find that I am able to do very well. But I just thought it was interesting to identify that in order for our brains to really feel restored and completely kind of have that beautiful kind of reset, we have to do almost literally nothing. And so I know personally for me, if I can reflect on my day, I know that there is almost no time where I do literally nothing. Even the times when I am supposed to be doing nothing, I'm trying to multitask and do something else. So I think if we kind of just use this as a kind of thought experiment in terms of how much our teens are engaging in even downtime, they're probably always doing something. So I think that we can think about back to the emotional regulation and stress responses, those dopamine receptors, how our sensory systems are processing and handling stress. If we're constantly doing something, our brain is constantly under a very low level of stress because it's having to process and utilize sensory information or cognitive information in some capacity. So I think it's important to think of, am I giving my teen or am I giving myself some actual restorative downtime? Or am I spending all of my time doing things that I really enjoy and then I'm really happy and I'm very, engaged, but I'm not spending time doing something that is truly letting my brain kind of take that breath. And so we wanted to talk about a couple different things for the final parts of our presentation that were kind of the hot topics. And I think were some of the things that have come up a lot in terms of things that you as parents and also us as clinicians have found have been things that are very common for the teens that we work with, or the teens that are our children. So we're going to talk a little bit about screen time and technology. We're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about stress management and being bored. So I'm going to quickly just briefly talk about screens and technology. So we all know, and there's lots of research out there, that too much screen time can kind of, be quote unquote bad for your brain. But in the world that we're living in right now, it's actually very challenging because a lot of what our teens do at school, a lot of we do at work, a lot of what we do in our personal time is very connected to screens. We're living in a very technologically advanced society that a lot of things are on the computer, that are on websites and things that we need to access. I know a lot of the teens that I work with, a lot of their homework is on a portal online that they have to go on and check in, or some of the textbooks. Actually, now a lot of the teens I work with, the textbooks that they're using, they're no longer physical textbooks, they're online. And so I think just being aware of how much screen time our kids or our teens are getting, I think is important. And I think being mindful of, if they have to do schoolwork, that's absolutely important, and allowing them to have the downtime to go on social media and connect with their friends and do these types of things is incredibly important, and I think is very necessary for what Rebecca will talk about later for the relationships and bonding. But just being aware of how much time they're spending on the screens and technology, because even though it may be fun and engaging or necessary for school, there is research to show, and we probably have all read an article or two about it, that excessive use of screen time can really impact sleep. It can impact our emotional regulation, and it also can impact physically the structure and stress of our eyes as well, because our eyes interpret the blue light from screens differently than it does sunlight from our environment. So actually how our eyes produce tears and how frequently we blink can be impacted by how much screen time that we have.
Thanks, Kate. So relationships, our teens don't exist in a silo. Relationships and relating to people in their lives can impact their emotional regulation. Sometimes parents will say, well, my teen has, I get this great feedback from teachers, and they're out just doing all these wonderful things with friends, but why are they such nightmares at home? And if you think about, somebody told me this one time about the day that your child has at school, or your child will get home from school, you might pick up your teen in the car, they may walk in the door and you say, oh my gosh, how was your day? And they grunt at you, or they're like, I can't talk to you right now. And you get this reaction like, oh my, who is this person that just walked in the door, and how are you so successful when you're not here and around me? And you think about what your teen's day is like. They are essentially, and like Kate said, some kids like school and like the lineup and like everything about their day that's largely not of their choosing. It is largely not of their choosing to get up at 6:30 in the morning, travel to school, be in one building for 6 to 7 hours, going through a series of classes, meetings, as we could relate to, on topics not necessarily of their choice, sitting with people that they might not have chosen to sat next to, with a few minutes in between classes to re-regulate, switch things up, having a lunch that's 20 or so minutes, leaving, and not to mention the social dynamics going on there. And then they have the 24/7 world of socializing that follows them home, and they're done. Like Kate said, they're kind of toast, some of them, but then maybe they have a sport after school, they have an activity. So how your teen interacts with their world and the people around them can be very regulating or dysregulating. We can find, and so what I generally tell parents, if anybody's curious, maybe don't bombard your teen with questions right after school. Maybe let them be quiet. I know sometimes it's hard to sit with the quiet, but allow your teen to access whatever coping skills they have after a long day, whether that is putting their earbuds in and listening to music. Some parents will say, well, I get my teen in the car and all they want to do is listen to music. Well, I'm not sure they've been able to listen to music for hours. And a lot of teens find music a great source of coping skill. It can allow them to escape into a song or a feeling or a sensation or an association of something positive for them. And so relationships, as I said, can be regulating or dysregulating. As Kate mentioned in one of her examples, if they're on their phone and they find that a friend posted something that they weren't tagged in, that can be very dysregulating for a teen. Their emotions can take over. They may be ready to fire off a text. Probably not a good idea, but the prefrontal just isn't loud enough. But what we can do as adults, because again, your teen may seem like an adult in some ways, but you are ultimately the adult. Maybe if your teen comes to you incensed that their friend just posted this and they really want to, you know, go off on them, maybe what you need to do is help down regulate them, validate. That's really hard. You're upset. It must be really, without saying like, oh my gosh, she's a terrible friend. That's only going to upregulate your teen. You want, there's this term we like to, or this phrase we like to use that one of my colleagues, LLC, and it's a connection before correction. Connect where they are, validate them. Validating your teen helps regulate a little bit. It makes your teen feel known, heard, which is why a really secure friendship can help regulate your teen. Lots of the secure friendships they have are regulating because your teen feels known, understood, accepted. The ones that pose a threat, fire off that amygdala and that limbic system, they're the ones that can dysregulate your teen. So there are so many opportunities for our teens' self-worth to rise and fall based on all the different relationships in their lives. So it's really important that we remember what their lives are like and what they're interacting with in the day-to-day. And now Kate is going to talk next about stress management.
Yeah.
We both are, but why don't you kick it off?
Yeah, Rebecca, can you go quickly back to the relationship thing?
Oh,
there was
sure.
just something you mentioned I wanted to just tag off on. So something Rebecca mentioned that I think is really important is kind of letting our teens take that breath or letting them have that space. So letting, like, so say if they put the earbuds in or if they come home at the end of the day and you ask how school is and they're just kind of like, meh, sort of thing. So kind of thinking back to what we were talking about in terms of being able to access that frontal lobe, being able to process and talk about what the day was like, or if you guys have a disagreement or an argument or a fight, and being able to process what actually happened and being present in the moment and having that restorative relationship conversation about how, hey, you know, you did this, or being able to talk to your teen about that. You and your teen need to be in a place where you're able to have that rational conversation. And that needs to be in a place where you are regulated and organized enough to be able to access your frontal lobe skills, to be able to have that functional conversation. And there's lots of studies out there. And from a sensory perspective, there's lots of information to show that when you are in that red zone, super heightened arousal where your amygdala is firing, you're in that stress, you're in that fight, flight, or fright, you really don't have access to your frontal lobe, even as an adult. You just don't have the ability to be able to have that rational thought and have that conversation. And so sometimes it's really important that even though you really want to, in that moment, process it and have that validation and, like, you know, say, like, you know, I really want to talk to you about this. Sometimes it's important to take that step back and say, okay, maybe I need to use some of my coping strategies, or maybe even though I really want to talk about it, I need to give my teen some space to be able to let them regroup so that you can have that restorative and really helpful conversation. And it may not be at the time that we want, and it may not be at the time that is, like, you know, in the moment that we're looking for, but in order for it to be the most successful and for us to have the relationship with our teens and be able to make those ongoing changes and help to correct some of those more challenging behaviors if we're seeing them, is being able to access them at a moment when they are regulated. And that can be really challenging. And as a parent, it can also be incredibly frustrating if you want to really talk about something right now. Hey, especially if they're doing something that's bothering you. Like, hey, no, wait a minute, I want to talk about this. If they're not in that space, you might not get that productive conversation that you're looking for.
So important.
So stress management. So I know that we're definitely going to, like we mentioned, we're going to send out a list of some coping strategies, but I think the biggest things for stress management is kind of really looking at what are some of the stressors. And sometimes what can be a really helpful activity that I've done with a lot of the clients that I work with that have been of this age is sometimes sitting down and just having a conversation about it. You can just start writing it out, like what things are stressful for you, what things are challenging for you. Sometimes writing down, I've done like a quick schedule activity where you write down like what the day looks like and how many different things you do during the day. And sometimes even just writing it down, it can be a little bit enlightening to see how much time do I have during the day to have some of that restorative downtime? How much time during the day do I have to implement some of these coping strategies? And if your teen has a really busy schedule and there isn't a lot of downtime, I have a teen I work with, and I think we did her schedule the other day, and I think she had 15 minutes at the end of the day before she had her swim practice. And then I think she had half an hour at the end of the day after dinner. So it's not a lot of time, more time on the weekends, obviously, to, spend with family and friends, but not a lot of time during the day to be able to implement it. So her coping strategies and her toolkit of stress management looks a lot different than, say, a teen or, someone who doesn't have an after school sport. So I think it's important to look at the whole picture of what are they doing during the day? What are the expectations that are placed on them? What do they need to do in terms of their schedule? And then how can we find stress management skills or coping skills or sensory strategies that fit within not only your family dynamic and your teen's personality and their own personal preferences, but also their schedule and their routine, because that's the most important part. Like Rebecca mentioned, our teens have to want to do this. And so the easier we can make it, the easier it is for them to access them and the more likely they are to do them. If it's something they're going to have to take out of social time, or they're going to have to take time away from something that they enjoy to do this, they're less likely to be engaged in something like this, as are we if we had to do something, take away something preferred to do something like this.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to say, not going to take away anything important, but I wanted to mention that if your teen doesn't talk to you and won't sit down and have this conversation about their stressors, there was recently a study done in Darien on 7th to 12th graders that found that the biggest stressors in their lives were getting good grades, getting into a good college, standardized tests, and meeting parental expectations. And also, as part of this study, the protective factors, the factors that allow teens to manage these stresses, are open lines of communication with the parents, as well as that sense of feeling valued, having that sense of agency. I'm in control. I can do things for myself, and purpose. So those are just those. I just think it's really important to remember that when you're thinking about how to best support your teen and how to put your teen in as much as you can situations that promote that sense of self and self-development and identification as they're in this important developmental stage. Open lines of communication, feeling a sense of agency, value, and purpose. So did you want to say anything else about stress management, Kate?
No, I think we're good. Yeah. And I think kind of like Rebecca mentioned, just in terms of having some time at the end to be able to answer questions, we quickly just wanted to talk about being bored. Being bored kind of has started to become like a 5-letter word. And so a lot of times we find that even just that feeling of boredom can almost have a spike of almost anxiety. It's like, oh, I'm bored. Oh, I don't know what to do. Rebecca and I were actually talking about this when we were creating the presentation of how even, waiting in the line, say at the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, we find that, oh, I don't know what to do. Okay, I'm going to hop on my phone and, start checking through my emails and realizing, oh, I could just stand here for 5 minutes, but our natural inclination is to fill that time. And so I think it's important to identify and kind of recognize and model ways to use boredom. And if you're bored, okay, you may not need to do something. You may not need to fill that time. And if you are feeling bored, what can you do with that time instead of going straight to, say, scrolling through, Instagram or TikTok or doing some of those other things, if that's not the most productive use of the time. But kind of let it, like I'm kind of circling back to what I mentioned before in terms of that restorative downtime. Sometimes being bored is that opportunity to use a little bit of that time to try to model some of that restorative downtime or utilize a coping strategy. It doesn't always have to be filled with something. Boredom doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Agreed. And that I was going to say about the restorative downtime, it generally, if you're, and it's hard. Like I know with my kids, when they say I'm bored, I get anxious. I'm like, oh, they're upset. And now I need to fill their time with something. It's good to model it yourself. And maybe you have a time at your house on like an afternoon or an evening once a week where all the phones go away, screens are off, and people just find things to do in your house. And that can be a coping skill in and of itself, as Kate was referring to, or a development of one. You might find that you're doing something more meditative. You're putting a puzzle together. You're building something. Maybe you're doing yard work, all of that, where you're just thinking about a task or something that you're engaging in that is familiar and you're not receiving lots of input. Probably, I don't know, maybe your kids start to fight and that's a whole other situation. But I think it's great to model for your kids being bored and how it's actually not a 5-letter word and how it can be something that's helpful for you to re-regulate and explore other parts of yourself that maybe you aren't as able to Kate's point, we're also overscheduled. So, and that's Kate, did you want to say anything else about being bored?
No, I think we're good. I think we wanted to mention our last slide. Yeah.
So we wanted just to mention this Tween mental health online survey that is out there. There's really a woman named Amanda Craig, who is a licensed marriage family therapist. She owns Manhattan Marriage Family Therapy in Manhattan and Darien, works with teens and tweens. And this initiative that Sasko River is supporting is the development of a tween screen to detect early mental health concerns and family concerns from the tween's point of view. The screen will eventually offer parents, pediatricians, and schools early risk and protective signs. You can go to the link that we placed on here and complete it with your 9 to 14-year-old. It is in the developmental stages, so your feedback will be an integral part of the development. Amanda has also found that it's generated some great discussion between parents and tweens when they've taken it. She gave us some stats. The CDC still reports that 20% of children suffer from diagnosable mental health conditions, and half of those will show signs and symptoms before the age of 14. While these trends have continued to alarm us in the field, the assessment tools that can help with early diagnosis and treatment have not advanced since the 90s. So they're doing this field of study and asking people to take part in it. And I think it would be a great for you and your team to complete, and also just to promote this tween screen that's going to be available when they collect all the data. So thank you for your attention on that.
I just sorry, Rebecca, pardon my interruption, but yeah. I also, there's the QR code, but if people don't like the QR code, there's also the link at the bottom, which will get you there, the short link there.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, we have a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions that Kate and I can answer, I know we want to compile a list of coping strategies too. We'd be happy to talk.
There is a question while people unmute themselves. There is a question in the chat if we can get a list of coping skills.
Yes. Yep.
You mentioned that, but are you going to give that to me separately so that I can add with the slides, or how?
Yes, we can do that. Yep.
Okay. So yeah, you feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions at this point.
Ooh, that's a great question. So Allison is asking, how do you help your teen develop a purpose? It's a really good question.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Develop a purpose. You know, purpose can be defined in different ways, I guess. One being, you know, what kind of hat they want to wear, you know, their purpose being academic, as a friend, as a teammate, how to develop that. I hear a lot of parents say, well, my teen doesn't have any interests. How do I get my teen to develop an interest? And it's really, when parents of teens say, how do I, it's especially hard, because depending on your relationship with your teen might not take it from you. You know, sometimes teens often look at the parent as a reminder of childhood, and they're in this phase where they're individuating and trying to pull away. So even if you might have this wonderful idea about this volunteer opportunity that they might hook into, and that could be a sense of purpose, maybe if they hear it from somebody else, maybe in encouraging relationships with other adults in their lives, or noticing that a friend is doing this, I wonder, you know, we'd be happy to sign you up for that as well. Just exposing your child to your teen, different conversations, different things going on in the world, current events, just making sure it really boils down to open lines of communication. So whether or not your teen will talk to you, you can still have an open line of communication with them by being present in their life, driving in the car with them, sharing space with them, noticing things, and just opening up the blinders to helping them to take the blinders off and see the world at large can just expose them to different different areas that where they can maybe hook into a sense of purpose. But that's a great question and quite challenging. Not
Yeah.
easy.
And I think too, kind of my comment here, like Rebecca mentioned, I definitely don't think is like, a catch-all in terms of answering the questions, but in terms of kind of looking to see like developing a teen's purpose, if there's something that your teen is very interested in, but you're trying to help guide them into something more kind of global or doing something different, you can kind of do a little bit of that detective work in terms of those sensory things. So are they someone that comes home and just goes straight into the room and just wants to play video games and like is having a really tricky time kind of opening up and like doing things outside of the house or things like that? So then kind of looking from a sensory perspective and seeing, okay, are they doing that because they need more time to decompress? And some of those larger, more social things like group sports or group activities are a little overwhelming for them. Kind of using that lens of what kind of things can I guide them towards that might be more in alignment with we call it their sensory profile, like how, like, and everyone has their own sensory profile, but what kind of best feeds their sensory systems, what makes them feel the best in themselves, and then kind of what activities can have that as well. And like Rebecca mentioned, if it has some of that intrinsic motivation, either coming from somebody else outside of you as the parent, or also has some of those naturally interesting or driving sensory components that they feel like, good about, then that can also be a motivating factor that can help them as well. But again, like Rebecca mentioned, it can be tricky, but I think trial and error sometimes can be the best in that situation. And so Allison, I think that's a really great question. I think one of the things that we can do is that, so me and Rebecca's emails are right here at the end of the presentation. So if you wanted to, you could reach out to me and Rebecca, and I think that we could further answer that question for you. But that also is for anybody who is interested. Our emails are here. So if you guys would like to reach out with any individual questions about your teen, about, questions at large, about any of the programs we offer at SASCO, we'd be more than happy to help kind of guide you in terms of that as well. But no, Allison, I definitely encourage reaching out to us because we can definitely answer that question in a little more detail. All right, well, we would love to continue, but I think everybody, like we mentioned, everyone's got their schedule, so I bet you everyone's got some place to be, but we really appreciate you guys taking all of the time to come and listen. We really appreciate you kind of, opening your ears and opening your eyes to some of these perspectives that Rebecca and I were able to kind of present today. And we hope that we're able to answer some of the questions, or that you took away some kind of helpful information from this, because this is something Rebecca and I are really passionate about. And so we were really happy to share the passion with you guys today. Like we mentioned, our emails are here if you guys have any questions, and we will be, like Mark mentioned, when the presentation is sent out, we will also have an attached list of coping strategies that you guys can have access to as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, just adding to that, I plan to have that out on Monday.
Okay, awesome.
Terrific.
All right, thank you so much, guys. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Thank you both. That was great, very informative. And thank you to all of our guests. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.